Welcome back to Serafina and the Black Cloak by Robert Beatty. Today we are going into Chapter 7. Hey Renegades! We are back with Chapter 7 of Serafina and the Black Cloak. If you were with us for Chapter 6, you know that Serafina is somewhere where she's not supposed to be, and now she and Braden are also somewhere that's probably not the best spot. So let's get started, because I can't wait anymore. Serafina climbed slowly out of the carriage and stood at Braden's side. The forest surrounded them, black and impenetrable. The craggy barked trees packed densely together. Her legs jittered beneath her, filled with nervous impulse. She tried to steady her breathing. Her whole body wanted to move, but she forced herself to stay with Braden and Gideon. She watched and listened to the unnaturally quiet forest, extending her senses out into the void. She couldn't hear a single toad or whippoorwill, but it felt like there was something out there, something big, but extremely quiet. She didn't even know how that was possible. Gideon stood beside her on full alert, staring into the trees. Whatever it was, he sensed it too. Braden looked warily into the darkness that surrounded them and walked forward a few feet in the direction the carriage was facing. "I wish I had a lantern," he said. "I can't see anything at all." The horses fidgeted in their harnesses, their hooves shifting uneasily in the gravel. "When they're scared, they move their feet," Braden said sympathetically. "They have no claws, no sharp teeth, no weapons. Their speed is their main defense." She marveled at how Braden didn't just see the horses, but understood how they thought. When a breeze passed through the woods and rattled the branches of the trees, the horses spooked. All four of them pulled and tugged against their harnesses. It was like they were being attacked by some invisible predator. Squealing, the front two horses reared up on their hind legs and struck the air with their hooves. As Serafina shrank back from the danger in frightened dismay, Braden rushed forward and put himself between her and the horses. Standing in front of them, he raised his open hands to calm them. They towered above him, their eyes white with fear, their heads thrashing and their hooves flying. She was sure they were going to kick him in the head or slam him in the shoulder or trample him to death. But he stood with his hands raised, speaking to them in soft, gentle tones. "It's all right. We're all here," he said to them. "We're all together." To her astonishment, the horses were calmed by his presence and his words. He touched their shoulders with his outstretched hands and seemed to bring the rearing horses back to the ground. Then he held the head of the lead horse in his hands and pressed his forehead to the horse's forehead, so that they were looking at each other eye to eye. And he spoke to the horse in quiet, reassuring tones. "We're in this together, my friend. We're going to be all right. There's no need to run, and there's no need to fight." The lead horse breathed heavily through its nose as it listened to Braden's words, then settled and became still. The other horses quieted as well, reassured by the young master. "How did you do that?" she stammered. "These horses and I have been friends for a long time," he replied, "but nothing more." Still astounded by what he'd done, she looked around at their surroundings. "What do you think frightened them?" "I don't know," he said. "I've never seen them so scared." Braden turned and looked down the road ahead of them. He squinted into the darkness, and then he pointed. "What is that up there?" he asked. "I can't make it out. Does the road turn?" She looked in the direction he pointed. It wasn't a turn in the road. It was a huge tree with thick, gnarly branches, and a scattering of blood-red leaves lay across the road, completely blocking their path. Suddenly, Mr. Crankshot emerged out of the darkness, trudging his way back to the carriage. "We're gonna need the axe," he grumbled angrily. Serafina and Braden looked at each other in surprise, then looked back at Mr. Crankshot. "Where have you been?" Braden asked. "We're gonna need the axe," Mr. Crankshot said again, ignoring the question. "I'll get it, sir," the assistant coachman said as he came running up from behind Mr. Crankshot. She hadn't noticed him before, but the assistant coachman was just a skinny boy with a mop of curly hair. He stood no taller than the shoulders of the lead horse and had thin arms and legs, bony knees and elbows, and a coltish skittishness about him. He wore a coachman's jacket, but it was several sizes too big in the shoulders, and the sleeves were too long. His black coachman's top hat seemed ridiculously tall on his little head. The boy couldn't have been older than 10. He ran to the rear of the carriage, opened the wooden storage box, and grabbed the axe, which looked huge in his hands. "That's Nolan," Braden said, leaning toward her. "He's actually one of the best carriage drivers we have, and he takes very good care of the horses." "Give it to me," Mr. Crankshot barked as he grabbed the axe out of Nolan's hands and stomped over the fallen tree. "I can help out too, sir, I can," Nolan said, tagging along behind him with a small hatchet. "Nah, you can't. Just stay out of the way, boy," Mr. Crankshot shouted. He seemed irritated that Nolan was even there. Mr. Crankshot heaved the axe behind him in a great sweeping swing and slammed the blade into the center of the trunk. The leaves of the tree shuddered with the force of the blow, but it hardly made any dent at all in the thick bark. He swung the axe again and finally cut through the bark. Wood chips began to fly. Serafina couldn't help but notice the brute strength of the man, but it was hard for her to tell if this was the same type of strength the man in the black cloak had possessed. "At any rate, we're going to be here all night," Mr. Crankshot complained, and just kept chopping. "I'm sure I can help, sir, I'm sure I can," Nolan said enthusiastically, standing by with his hatchet ready. "I'm sure you can. Now get back and stay out of the way," Mr. Crankshot shouted. "You're no use to anybody here, boy." As the grumpy Mr. Crankshot made war on the tree, Serafina noticed Braden looking around them, trying to figure out if there was a way to navigate the carriage around the obstacle. But the trees of this wicked forest grew so closely together that a man could barely get through them, let alone a carriage with a team of horses. "Where are we?" Serafina asked. "I think we're about 11 or 12 miles from the estate, a place called Darden Forest," Braden said. "There used to be an old town nearby." "Haven't been any people living in that village for years," Mr. Crankshot grumbled as he chopped at the tree. "Nothing but ghosts and demons left in these woods now." Serafina scanned the forest, filled with a sense of foreboding. It felt like they were being watched, but she couldn't figure out why she couldn't detect who or what was out there. Her ears twitched with nervousness. The trees slowly swayed back and forth in the wind. They were covered in strange gray lichen that strung with grayish-white moss, which hung down like the thin hair of an old dead woman. The branches buffeted and creaked as if anxious in their plight. It appeared that many of the trees were dying. She walked along the length of the fallen tree. She thought it was peculiar that the tree still held its red leaves this late in the year, but it was what she saw at the base of the trunk that truly disturbed her. "Come look at this, Braden," she said. "What have you found?" he asked as he came up behind her. "I thought the tree must be an old snag that had rotted and fallen over the last storm, but take a look." The stump of the tree didn't appear rotted, and it didn't have the fibrous appearance of a trunk that had been snapped by high winds. It was difficult to tell, but it almost appeared as if it had been gnawed by giant teeth or cut down with an axe. "Look at the angle here," Braden said, gesturing at the side of the stump in anger and confusion. Someone purposely felled this tree so that it would block the road. Gideon barked and made Serafina jump a mile. As the dog kept barking, Braden knelt at his side and put his hands on the dog's back. "What's wrong, boy? What do you smell?" "If it's all right with you," Mr. Crankshot said gruffly, "we're not going to wait to find out." Spooked by the dog and apparently convinced that he'd cut through enough of the trunk, Mr. Crankshot dropped the axe, braced his heavy boots against the earth, and grabbed hold of the branches. He tried to drag the tree off the road, but it was far too large for him to budge. Braden and Nolan ran forward to try to help. The whole time, Gideon just kept barking. "Somebody hit that dog and shut it up!" Mr. Crankshot shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "Mr. Crankshot, I think we should turn the carriage around and go back the other way," Braden said sharply, obviously perturbed by his comment about the dog. Mr. Crankshot agreed, but at that moment a loud cracking sound filled the forest. Serafina crouched, prepared to spring. A great shattering of wood erupted into an explosive crash as a large tree fell across the road behind them. The horses squealed in panic and went up, rearing and striking, pulling on their leather harnesses and dragging the carriage across the ground, even though the brake was engaged and the wheels wouldn't turn. Their instinct was to run, whether they were free of the harnesses or not. Braden ran forward to help them. "No, Braden!" Serafina cried as she reached to stop him. The boy seemed determined to get himself killed by a horse kick. Braden leapt in front of the horses. He was able to calm them with a few soft words and quickly got them under control. Seeing that he was safe, Serafina scanned the forest in the direction of the fallen tree. That's when she realized that the worst had happened. The carriage, its 4 horses, the 4 humans, and the dog were now trapped on a section of the road between 2 trees. Mr. Crankshot, gripping the axe, stomped to the back of the carriage and shouted furiously into the darkness, "Who's out there? Show yourselves, you rotten, filthy swine!" Serafina looked into the darkness, waiting for an answer to come, but Mr. Crankshot's words drifted out into the black nothingness without reply. "Mr. Crankshot," Braden said firmly, "we need to go back to cutting the tree in front of us. The safest course now is to press on to Asheville." "I just hope we can get there," Mr. Crankshot carped beneath his breath, stomping back. As Mr. Crankshot, Braden, and Nolan worked on the tree, Serafina couldn't help but look behind the carriage where the most recent tree had fallen. Gideon was looking in the direction as well, his eyes black in the starlight. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered as she crouched beside him and peered into the darkness. "Is there something out there?" She and the dog were on the same side now. She wondered about the second fallen tree. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone deliberately blocking them in so that they could not escape. She scanned the forest. She had good senses, but she knew she couldn't smell nearly as well as Gideon, and he seemed to smell something right now. He wasn't barking anymore, but was staring intently into the forest, waiting for something to appear. For all his faults as a dog, he was a brave defender. But she hated this. The looking, the waiting, feeling like a trap was slowly surrounding them. She couldn't stand it. She didn't know how to defend. She knew how to hunt. And right now, it felt like they were the ones being hunted. And she didn't like the feeling one bit. She took a few steps forward into the trees to see how it felt. Her skin crawled with equal parts fear and excitement. She was drawn into the forest. Her instinct was telling her to go deeper. She took a few more steps. Gideon looked at her and tilted his head as if to say, "Are you crazy? You can't go in there." But then she padded quietly into the trees and ducked into the underbrush. She wanted to move, to prowl, to see what was out there, whatever it was. She wanted to be the hunter, not the hunted. Leaving Gideon to guard the carriage, she crept deeper and deeper into the darkness of the forest. The very same black forest that her father had told her never to enter. The very same dark forest that Craigshot had said was filled with ghosts and demons. She was calm. She was in the right place. She figured if her mother could move through the forest at night, then so could she. Suddenly, she heard the sounds of footfalls in the brush in front of her, as clear as a rat's footsteps in the basement, but much louder and much larger, moving through the leaves and the dirt. She wasn't sure whether it was an animal or a human. As she crept closer to the sound, she crouched down but kept moving slowly forward. Sound and sight and feeling and smell, her whole body felt alive with sensation. With all her senses working, all her muscles in play, she stalked so slowly, so quietly, that she didn't make a single sound. She heard the footsteps ahead of her more closely now, feet crunching through autumn leaves, walking at first and then breaking into a run. A man running through the underbrush. Some 50 yards out into the woods, she ran toward the sound, knowing that when a rat was moving, it couldn't hear nearly as well as when it wasn't. When the man suddenly stopped, she stopped as well and remained perfectly still, holding her breath. She knew the man must be listening for her, but she made no sound. As soon as he started moving again, she moved as well, shadowing him. But then something happened. The footsteps stopped. She felt a swooshing sensation of air on her face and head, like the beat of a vulture's wing. And then suddenly, she heard a second set of footsteps behind her, between her and the carriage. How was that possible? Were there multiple attackers? The forest erupted into a cacophony of sound. Leaves crashing, sticks breaking, the rush of rapid movement. Her muscles exploded into life. It was an attack coming in from all directions. In the distance, Gideon started barking and snarling and gnashing his teeth as if he were facing down Satan himself. The carriage, she thought. They're attacking the carriage. She turned and sprinted towards it, heedless of the sound she made. She glimpsed a flash of movement surge past her in the darkness, but could not tell what it was. As she ran toward the carriage, she could see Braden and Nolan. But where was Craigshot? He was the strongest person in their group, the man who was supposed to be protecting them. "Look out, Braden!" she shouted in warning. "They're coming! Look out!" Hearing her call, Braden turned just in time to dodge the flashing shape as the incoming attacker. But then, in a startling movement of swirling black shadow, the attacker turned and was upon him again. Gideon charged in, snarling and biting. Nolan punched and kicked, fighting, shouting, striking. All was confusion and a swirl of motion and battle. Just as Serafina came within striking distance, a large black shape floated past her. She flinched so hard that her back hit a tree. Giant centipedes poured out of the logs. Worms oozed up out of the earth. The man in the black cloak had come. He was here in these woods. There weren't multiple attackers. There was only one. He seemed to float on the violence of the battle, his decaying, blood-dripping hands reaching outward as he came upon Braden. It was clear he wanted the boy in particular. Serafina leapt forward to defend her friend. Gideon charged as well, but it was little Nolan, in a desperate act of shouting courage, who threw himself in front of the young master and blocked the attack. The man in the black cloak opened his arms and pulled Nolan to his chest, the slithering folds of the cloak wrapping around the boy. Nolan's shouts turned to screams. The gray smoke filled the forest. The rattling shook the trees, and then Nolan disappeared. It took her breath away to see it again. "No!" she cried out in anguish, fear, and frustration. Then the shaking came, and the glowing, and the terrible stench that followed. Every leaf on every tree around them suddenly fell to the ground, drenched with blood, and the ground itself became a stinking, horrific mud. Expanded in size and now seemingly more powerful than ever, the man in the black cloak advanced, heading straight for Braden once more. Braden needed to fight or flee, but he stood frozen in shock by what he'd just seen happen to Nolan. He stared at the man in the black cloak, unable to move. Without thinking, Serafina charged forward and pounced on the man's back, her caterwaul wild and crazed, screeching of anger. Her hands and feet clawed at the man with snarling ferocity. The man in the black cloak had no choice but to turn and fight her. He tried to pull her off his back and wrap her in his voluminous black cloak like he had the others, but Braden pulled back a mighty swing and slammed the man's head with a large branch. Gideon lunged forward and bit the attacker repeatedly. Serafina tore herself free, rolled on the ground, spun, and leapt back into the battle. All three of them pressed the attack. The man in the black cloak, his eyes still glowing with power, levitated upward. 3 against 1 now. He had lost the element of surprise. He snapped the billowing folds of the black cloak with his arm, and a great explosion of air knocked Serafina off her feet. She went tumbling backward as the man in the black cloak withdrew into the forest, and then was gone. Gasping to catch her breath, Serafina scrambled to her feet and readied herself for the next attack, but it never came. The battle was over. She looked at her hands. Her fingers were slippery with blood, and her fingernails had torn at the man in the black cloak's rotting skin. But it was more than just the remnants of the battle. It was like the skin in the glove. He was disintegrating. Through the darkness, she saw Braden lying on the ground. Frightened that he'd been wounded, she ran over to him. "Are you hurt?" she sputtered. "I'm all right," he gasped as she helped him onto his feet. "What about you? Did he hurt you?" "I'm all right," she said. I don't understand, Serafina. What was that thing? What happened to Nolan?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head in frustration. "I mean, where did he go? Is he dead?" She didn't know the answer to Braden's questions. Thinking about poor little Nolan made her sick to her stomach, angry, frightened. He was just gone. How could she help him? It was the second time she battled the man in the black cloak, and the second time she'd lost a friend. "Come on, we gotta go before it comes back," she said, touching his shoulder. "What happened to Crankshot?" Braden asked as he and Gideon followed her back toward the carriage and horses. "I never saw him," she answered. "Do you think it got him too?" She could hear the fear and confusion in his voice. "No. There's a rattling sound when it does it, and there was only one rattle." "You know what it is," he said, grabbing her arm and bringing her to a stop. "Tell me, Serafina." "I saw it last night," she said. "It took Clara Brahms the same way." "What? What do you mean? Where? Does this mean that Clara's dead? I don't understand what's going on." "Neither do I," she said, "but we've got to go." Braden picked up a stick from the ground and looked out into the forest. Whatever it is, it's still out there. She knew he was right. They had fought it off, but it was definitely still out there. She couldn't forget the image of Nolan leaping forward to save his master. She could still see the terror-stricken look on the boy's face right before he disappeared. As she looked at Braden, she couldn't help the terrible sinking feeling that crept into her mind. "Whatever it is," she said, "it didn't come for Nolan. It came for you." What? Oh my goodness. Things are so heating up, my friends. I'm so excited to be reading this book with you. And chapter 8 is only going to bring more amazingness to us. So, thank you for coming and enjoying Chapter 7 with me, and I look forward to Chapter 8 with you as well. See you later, Renegades. Hey, Renegades! Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of Serafina's adventure as we move through Serafina and the Black Cloak. See you later, Renegades!